Sometimes the best thing you can do for your poker win rate is to unlearn something rather than add more information. There are 5 poker myths that somewhere along the line many players came to believe as truth that are costing them tons of extra money. I've heard these falsehoods repeated so many times that I almost began to believe there was some sort of seminar where thousands of poker players were brought together and collectively and systematically brainwashed. Are you ready to stop bleeding money on these 5 myths? Watch this video as I debunk them and add a special bonus myth at the very end that I'm positive will apply to many of you. Coming in at number 5, we have big blind pot odds. So many people get this wrong. They believe that because of the great pot odds they're getting from the big blind, it can justify a call with pretty much any two, especially when there's a raise followed by a series of calls. The problem is when those series of calls come in, that lowers your equity with whatever hand you have from the big blind substantially. Because now you don't need to just beat the original raiser, you also have to beat the field. You're pretty much playing the lottery, you're trying to beat 4, maybe 5 players, and your equity is much, much lower with that many people in the field. Take, for example, an under-the-gun player or an early position raiser who opens, and say they're opening roughly a subset of 10% of hands. If you have Queen 10 offsuit in the big blind against this original opener, it's kind of a marginal defend. It really could go either way, and you're going to want to base your decision on like how well you think you're going to play against that particular player. Your hand has only around 33, 34% equity against that range, and it's going to be pretty marginal. It is that much more marginal, however, once there is an open and multiple callers. Now all of a sudden your pot odds look better. But say there was a 20% range calling followed by 2 more 20% ranges calling. These are like pretty common, like live poker player middle position flatting ranges we're going to put in. Now all of a sudden your equity isn't 34%, it's more like 15%. And you need to be getting substantially better pot odds. Now you need more like 5-to-1 pot odds to make it worth it. And that's not even factoring in one of the most important things, which is with this many players in the pot, your equity realization will be terrible. So it's helpful to think of your big blind pot odds as like, whatever equity I have in this spot, I really have maybe only 2/3 of that, because I'm only going to realize around 2/3 of that from out of position and without the initiative. So often I'm going to check fold to C bets, so often my opponent is going to make a bet, or someone out in the field is going to make a bet, and I'm not going to be able to hit my hand by the end. So this type of hand, very, very marginal, even more marginal as there's a raise in multiple callers, and GTO Wizard certainly agrees. You can see here, once there's a raise and the button calls, this hand goes from being a partial defend heads up to a pure fold multi-way. So coming in at number 4, we have betting to find out where I'm at. You will hear this one all the time in live poker, players justifying their betting decisions and saying, well, I had to put out a bet and find out where I'm at. The problem with this is it's not a reason for betting that connects to any of our reasons for betting that actually make you profit in the game. The betting reasons in poker that actually make you money are getting a hand to fold from your opponent, like either like a better hand than yours, which would be a bluff, or potentially folding out like a hand that has equity against your hand, which would be a protection bet. So that's a form of betting. That's an equity denial bet. Or we have betting for value, of course, like getting called by a worse hand. Betting for information doesn't really do either of these things, and you're paying a price to do it. Let's take, for example, you have pocket kings. You just 3-bet a button opener from the small blind, and the button calls you. And we get an ace of hearts, 6 of spades, 7 of hearts flop, okay? So some people, they will defend their pot-sized bet here by saying, I had to bet that size to find out where I'm at. The problem is when a bet of this size is called, you know where you're at. You are an equity underdog almost all the time when you go this big and you're called. You also don't even know if your opponent has an ace or has a flush draw or has a straight draw or 2-pair or a set. But all you know is you've shoveled in a bunch of money from out of position with a medium strength hand. You've been called. Your size was so big that when called, you're now an underdog. And there's really no plan other than waving the white flag here and kind of checking it down and hoping for the best. A much better approach would be to value stack preservation. and recognize that a small bet could work better here, targeting more things in the middle of your opponent's range. You also could have considered a check, and checking is something that yields information just the same way betting does. If you check and your opponent checks back, you get information about a lot of things that your opponent doesn't have, because it's likely he would have bet his sets, his two pairs, his strong ace-x hands when checked to on this board. So when he checks back, he probably doesn't have those hands. You've gained just as much information as you would have by betting, and you didn't have to spend a penny to do it. So betting to find out where we're at, we can test that this is a ridiculous idea for betting by just looking at one of the extremes. What if your plan was, I'm going to bet to find out where I'm at, and my plan is I'm going to go all in to do so. Okay, we don't actually see this in live poker because people know this is ridiculous, but one way to look at whether something is logically viable is to look at the extreme of the condition. What if our plan was, on this board with pocket kings, I'm going to bet all in to find out where I'm at? Well, guess what? When your opponent folds, you found out where you're at. He likely didn't have an ace or better. And when he calls, you find out where you're at, but all your money is gone and you're drawing to a 2-out hand. So could this actually be a good strategy? Probably not. We probably should be betting for equity denial or for value, not to find out where we're at. Coming in at number 3, we have I needed to protect against flush draws. So there is something visual about the flush draw that causes many poker players to kind of like lose their minds. It's like their resources are under threat almost from this like highly visible factor that they need to protect against. However, it's important to recognize a few things. So number one, when you have your pretty good made hand, like a top pair type hand on a flush draw, like wet board, you're not that ahead of the flush draw on the flop. Like, even though you have quote unquote the made hand, it's more helpful to think in terms of equity here. Your hand may have only like 60% equity against your opponent's flush draw, which may have some additional outs. So is it really worth shoveling in all that money as a slight favorite when we're not really doing much protecting anyways? Our opponent isn't going anywhere with a hand that has this much equity. I will save you the suspense. So the reality is your opponent is going to call anyways with these hands, and he should be, because he has great equity, he has nice implied odds, and there's not a whole lot you can do to protect against him calling a flop bet with a high equity draw. So what's a better plan? A better plan is, rather than kind of spazzing out about protecting against draws and getting very visually fixated on the threat on the board, it's to value protecting your range and protecting your stack. It's recognizing that, yeah, we do want to protect against draws to some extent, in that we want to extract value from them while players are still drawing, but we also want to protect the rest of our stack behind. We don't want to be shoveling in so much money with medium marginal strength hands, prioritizing protecting against draws, and in the meantime, ignoring the other threat, which is that we could be shoveling in money with a hand that is actually currently beat, currently second best, completely crushed by the 2-pair plus hands in our opponent's range. And we need to think about, how is my hand going to perform as a whole when my opponent calls this bet? We also could have sized smaller on this flop, potentially expecting our opponent to call with many of these draws, and wait for a brickish turn where a lot of his draw equity diminishes. Now we can size up. Now he's clearly not getting the right odds to call with only one card left to come, and now we can cause him to make some mistakes. But guys, shoveling in a ton of money on the flop, opening ourselves up to potential raises and calls from very high equity ranges, not going to be a profitable strategy in poker. So coming in at myth number 2, we have the belief that a short-handed game is not as much action as a full ring game. A lot of players don't like to play in these short-handed games, and what they cite is, well, it doesn't have enough action. I want to wait till the table has more action, more players, and is full. And sometimes this can make some sense, like if the short-handed lineup is very tough, if it's full of pros, like I can get behind like game selecting around that, but making it a reason about there's not enough players is actually completely the opposite of reality. If we look at what proper strategy looks like in, say, a full ring game, like nine-handed, or don't even get me started on 10-handed poker, we're talking about proper strategy often involving playing 20% of hands or less. That is not a lot of action for you. Compare that to, say, a four-handed short-handed game. So now we're talking about the cutoff, who gets to open around 30% of hands. The button, if it folds to him, he gets to open around 50% of hands. Now you're V-pipping often. You're either in one of those late position battles right off the bat, or you're in the blinds and you get to defend quite often. So you're in the action more, you're playing wider ranges, it's more action all around. If you're in a full ring game, you have so many players left to act behind you that can wake up with big hands that it stops you from being able to engage in this type of play. So it's really a lot more action to play in the short-handed context. Now, if players are not comfortable with that much action, with the amount of ambiguous situations that maybe it puts you in that are a little bit of like those gray zones that they don't quite see as much in the full ring game, that's one thing to admit that, like, I'm just not that comfortable with that level of action, with, me having to play these marginal hands. That is totally different than saying, the game just doesn't have an action for me right now. And ironically enough, a lot of the players who refuse to sit in shorthanded games are the ones that are calling other players out for being overly tight and overly nitty. And so they have it completely backwards. The full ring game forces that level of tight play. The shorthanded games are the ones where you can really get out of line and play more hands and be in the action more. So our myth number one is the myth of I put you on ace king. I don't know where this originated. I don't know who brainwashed who and how this spread to this many people, but somehow when players open raise in live poker, there is a belief that that player just like has ace king in the minds of so many people, even in late position battles. So like I've been in spots before where I've raised from like the cutoff, and my cutoff range is maybe like 300 combos of hands, and a player will just say afterwards that like, you raised pre-flop, I put you on ace king. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wouldn't I have ace jack here? Wouldn't I have 9-10 suited here? Wouldn't I have ace 5 suited, pocket sevens? You get the idea. All of these hands could have taken the same action when I open raise from this position. And so the key takeaway is remembering to put your opponent on a range of hands, not one particular hand, and getting so myopically focused on that one hand that you miss all the other possibilities and you get blindsided post-flop. The funny thing about this is that many of these same players, when the board comes ace high and they're having ace queen, and previously they put you on ace king, now they find a way to put you on pocket jacks because they don't feel like folding their ace queen. That's one to wrap your head around a different time. We're not going to dive too deep into that. It's maybe a bit beyond our understanding. But one thing to keep in mind is that because all of this is happening in live poker, and there is this focus on always putting people on ace king, the value of ace king actually goes down quite a bit in live poker because it loses all of its like deception value. It's like, it's just harder to get value of like on an ace or king high board to get 3 streets when opponents are already thinking in these terms. However, not all is lost because you're raising a range of hands. So what's happening if one hand in your range is losing value? That's coming at the benefit of all of these other hands that opponents are not putting you on. Things like suited connectors, suited aces, low pocket pairs. Now you can spike an unlikely hand while your opponent's mind is on ace king that can really win a big payday. So the final myth that I'd like to add in as a bonus, we'll call it myth B or myth bonus for blockers, is something that I think affects many, many poker players. There is this concept of blockers that many people learn, and they learn that, like, correctly, having a blocker to a hand can be a good thing if you're going to make like a crazy bluff because it makes it less likely your opponent has the hands that you're blocking. Or you make a light call down. You don't believe your opponent has a certain hand because you're quote unquote blocking that hand. And what I've seen time and time again is people just overestimate the significance of holding these hands. We really need a different term for blocker. Like maybe the term should be like reducer or something just like a little bit less potent. But the reality is, like, when you have, say, pocket jacks and the board is 7, 8, 9, and like a nitty player leads into you and you decide to raise because you just don't think they have a straight and you have an overpair and you're going for protection. And let's say the nitty player now comes over the top and just jams for an enormous size. Okay. And say it's the type of player that's like not doing this like as a semi bluff that often, and they're not doing this with two pair for this amount. They may not even always do this with bottom set. So yeah, you have pocket jacks, and it's possible that like, they don't have jack 10, but it's still more likely that they have jack 10 when they take this play than that they have something else. If they started with 16 combinations of jack 10, say you raised, from like late position, they called in the big blind, they still have 8 combinations when you hold 2 jacks. That's not nothing. You are reducing the frequency by 50%, but you aren't eliminating it. So this is not the time to go making crazy hero calls when there are still an enormous amount of combos that are in your opponent's range that you don't block. You have only reduced down to losing to 8 things. Maybe he has some 5-6 suited, maybe he has some pocket 9s, but you're really not faring well here. And regardless of your blockers, this is probably not a good time to make a hero call. Similarly, there are times where you block certain hands as a bluffer, but you're up against such a calling station that it really doesn't matter, and it's easy to get too focused on your own hand strength without zooming out and thinking about the hands you're trying to get your opponent to fold and the fact this guy is a calling station and probably won't fold said hands. All of these things are going to dramatically increase your win rate if we deprogram some of these myths that were planted by something a long, long time ago in the minds of many poker players. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you liked it, please subscribe for more content just like this.